Good afternoon, everyone. Why don't we all come over here a little bit and make it a little more cozy. My name is Jens Hoffmann, and I'm the curator of Mementos, Souvenirs, Artefacts, and Other Curiosities, which is the exhibition that you see here in the back. And it's part of Art Brussels 2017. And I'm very delighted to have a guest here next to me, a frequent, long-time collaborator and friend, and an artist who I have a very soft spot for. And I always said to everybody, if I wanted to be an artist, I wanted to make work like Kris Martin. There's a sort of like beautiful, poetic, conceptual melancholy in his work that I respond to very, very well. So when I was asked who I wanted to talk to first in our rounds of conversations with artists, it was very much about asking Kris to be the first one to come here. And I just wanted to give you a quick introduction to the exhibition and how this came about, so you have a little bit of a context what we are going to talk about. We were invited, I was invited by the art fair to curate a show here at Tour and Taxis at the Hotel de la Poste. And I was thinking, like, what kind of exhibition can I do as a curator in contrast or in dialogue with the fair that's going on over there in the other building. And I was thinking a lot about the idea of values. On the one hand, the sort of monetary values and the exchange of funds and money for the purchase of artworks, and the sort of economical value of the paintings and sculptures and photographs that you see over there. And then on the other hand, something that's maybe more or better described as some form of personal value, or maybe emotional value, or sentimental value. So we asked 80 artists who were participating in the fair if they could give us an object that was very personal to them, that had a emotional or personal, sentimental significance to them. So thinking about these different forms of values, but also thinking about, like, what are these objects sort of telling us about the world we live in, and how do they also characterize perhaps a little bit some of the artistic attributes that the artists have in their work as artists. And if you recognize some of these names here, there's a little booklet where you find all the names in, and you go back to the other fair, you might find artworks by the same artist and sort of maybe see certain relationships there. And I just wanted to point out, before I start talking to Kris about this book, we collected stories in this book, and there's numbers on each page that correspond with the numbers in the vitrines, and so that you can then read the stories. Each artist has written a story about why she or he selected this object and what it means to them personally. So, Kris, tell us about the object that you chose, because I like your selection very much because it relates to another work that you made later on, and yeah, tell us.
Yeah, but first allow me to say that I have to congratulate you on this, again, very beautiful show, because it's curious to, it's problematic when you isolate an object from somebody's universe. Okay, what is it? It's just an object, and it can be, but I was pretty surprised that I was going through it, and through single objects you recognize actually universes. And that's so fantastic that one single object, whatever it might be, radiates somebody's universe. And it was very, very nice to discover that you were able to capture that. And so it's not mellow. And it's not arbitrary, I must say. So I'm very happy to be in, and exactly with a very, very tiny object. It's actually a little bell, a table bell, that I got as a present when I was 4 years old from my parents when we were on holiday. But we weren't on holiday because my parents couldn't afford holiday, but they were working there in a holiday club. And in a little souvenir shop, I was like falling in love with a stupid little table bell. But it was very precious to me until today. It's even more precious, but because in the run, it lost its clapper. And it was always, with me, it was like a silent table bell. It was always standing on my desk, my table, whatever, in my studio. And it gave me the inspiration of For Whom, a big installation with a bronze bell that tolls without the clapper, that is now standing in the garden, museum garden in Minneapolis. Yeah.
Well, what's interesting is that the difference in dimension between this bell and the other bell.
Yeah.
Because the other bell is like half the size of this room, and the small bell it's just like, you know. So
Yeah,
I think it's probably like 100 times bigger or 200 times bigger.
Yeah, but you always told me that size doesn't matter, Jens.
No.
So, yeah. No, but it's nice to see that everything is like pars pro toto, and toto is impossible to capture. But it's very nice that one single object can enhance people's imagination and thoughts. And even when you don't know the oeuvre of an artist, it's very inviting. And it comes always to the same. They can call my work conceptual, but in the end, it's matter. It's an image. It's something. And that's the misery in life, that only that matter can carry your thoughts and feelings longer than you can, because you're mortal, you see. So it has a certain morbid aspect as well, to me.
Well, I feel like most of your work, or many of the works, are sort of like little memento moris that always remind us also about our sort of dismiss, like eventually, you know, we will move on to somewhere else, and most of your work have that. So this sort of lifeless bell has lost its function, but it becomes an object that is much more about form and sort of shape and all of that.
Mm-hmm. But in general, objects losing their function can easily become art, because when the function's gone, there are other significations coming on. So that's basically what I see here around. And when I see then the other Kris Martin with a huge frog, then I ask myself, how far can you be, you know, from the other Kris Martin?
Well, yeah, it's quite a difference. But I wonder, when you walked through the exhibition, if there was other objects that you liked in particular that sort of resonated with you.
Yes. But it has to do with affinity. And sometimes it's nice to try to exclude your own affinities and to be open to, you know, to what you see, that nothing is standing between you and the object. Like knowledge or education or even tastes. And the openness is very important, because otherwise you would never be open to other one's universe. And I must say that in general, I try to open myself to other artists' universes for the simple reason that making art is a very lonely job. And making an exhibition is so nice, because then you come out and then you have talks like we did in the past. And then you feel like living again. And it's not mellow what I'm saying now, but there is no ism. There is no general flow. But it doesn't matter. We cannot step out of our time. We cannot step out of our... we are walking on the same globe, you know. And for that reason, 4 years ago, I started organizing shows myself, as you know, maybe.
Yes.
I'm not playing the curator. I know who am I, who I am. I am just an artist, okay? And in the end, when the exhibition's existing, I'm just one of the participating artists. But I'm not criticizing the market. I'm not criticizing institutions. But I think we all have to see and understand that more and more market and institutions are merging. And that institutions are really taking into account who is who and who is successful and who to show, because they need to sell tickets. And it's a reality I can understand. And I'm not a revolutionary person. I have not a single percentage of rock and roll in my body or my mind, I must admit. But I will not change anything. But I ask myself, at least, can we be artists again? Can we just do what nobody is waiting for? And for that reason, 4 years ago, I organized an exhibition in the Ghent Cathedral, where the Ghent altar by Jan van Eyck is standing. And I invited Jan Hoed Sr. As a curator. And I'm very proud about it, not because we had 240,000 visitors, Not that we did it without budget. The only reason why I'm proud about is simply that from that moment on, at least in Belgium, artists have contact again. They invite each other for lunch. They go to pubs. And before there was no contact at all. And I think it's super important that artists meet, that they talk, that they exchange. And I did it the second time 2 years ago in 4 little villages in the countryside where I'm living. And over 10,000 people visited the show. And then Jan Hoed Jr. was a curator, the son of Jan Hoed. And now I am preparing a third one, and I will involve you.
Oh, I didn't know about that,
yeah, but
I'm
now
very
you have
grateful.
witnesses.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So I like all those universes close together, to be honest, because it gives a very interesting tension.
I think it's very important that you have a dialogue and a community among artists. And Belgium seems to be a small enough country that it is possible for you to have dialogues with artists that live in Antwerp or Ghent or Bruges or all over the country, because it's relatively small. I wanted to ask you, and that's maybe sort of like a very general question, do you think there's anything, also sort of like looking back historically, that connects the art that's been made here, or is there an origin in modern art or in more recent contemporary art where you feel like a lot of artists look at? Because I feel there's a huge variety of art being made, but I cannot help of feeling that there is a certain sentiment that's very Belgium.
I think you're
right. I spent about 2 years here in the early 2000s, and I was completely confused about this country. That sort of made me almost schizophrenic.
I'm still very confused about this country. It will never stop. But a couple of years ago, I was at a fair. I think it was in Miami, and there's a guy coming to the booth. Now I don't go to fairs anymore. I learned my lesson. And there was an American guy coming and to the booth where my work was. He didn't know me at all. Neither did he know my name. And he said, "Oh, Belgian art," So he saw from a distance that it was Belgian art. And we have no identity, Belgium is problematic. Belgium is artificial, But I think there might be an identity in art, definitely. And like I said, we cannot step out of our time. Maybe Belgians cannot step really out of their context. And nobody taught me to make Belgian art, It was not intended, but somehow it's natural. And I cannot say what Belgian art is, but only if it's there, you see that it's Belgian. But there is absolutely a certain identity, I'm sure, yeah.
I mean, in your case, there's also sort of like a very particular sort of melancholic humor. Many of your works make me laugh, or at least giggle. It's very subtle. And maybe that comes out of like a little bit of a surrealist sort of spirit, sort of like displacing objects or altering objects from one to the other. And that perhaps is something that I felt could have been...
Well, I can explain maybe a part of it, of your question. I can answer maybe something to that. One of my best friends is a very famous doctor, and he's a radiologist. But he's interested in every aspect of medicine. And it's scientifically proved, what he said. And he also went to, meetings with doctors abroad, seminaries. Conferences, yeah. And, there was this disease, and this is a national disease. It's not a joke. And it's called synesthesia. At a certain point, 2 years ago, I wasn't able to make any work anymore. I thought it was like artist block or burnout thing, whatever. It had nothing to do with that. Imagine your brain is a computer, In order to calculate something very simple, you make 1 million calculations. So it's overheated immediately, and you're not able to solve the problem. And so I called the doctor, because he's the only doctor I trust. And he said, well, I will find out for you what it might be. And he went to Congress, And 2 weeks later, he comes to me and he said, well, I think I found the solution. He said, what is the color of the letter A? I say, blue, why? And he said, number 3, what is the color of 3? I said, yellow. Why? What are you doing? Is this a freak show? He said, no, I know already, you have synesthesia. And it's very Belgian. And he relates it to pollution and stuff like that. It's a long story, but I keep it short. You make useless associations all the time. And actually, I must admit, this is a very core of my work. You have object A, you have object B, that seem to have nothing to do with each other. But I see a connection, you know? And I might bring them together, and they call it art. It's a useless association. And then he studied further and further, and he said, look, in general, 3% of the people have it, all of us. And 30% of the artists have it. So was it the chicken or the egg? Did you become an artist because you had synesthesia? Yeah? Or vice versa? And that might maybe be a part of the explanation of what Belgian art might be. I think it's one big bunch of useless associations between objects.
I'm not sure how familiar the audience is. Are you familiar with Kris's work? Do you know what he's doing? A little bit?
Not much, I think.
No. So I was just wondering if you could maybe talk about some of the works that you've done. And I was very intrigued really by the very first piece that I saw, or that you described to me, which was a tree that you planted, a very small tree that was planted when you were born with a swing. And it took years for you to be able to use the swing because the tree had to grow so that the swing was actually up in the air and you could use it.
But that's a mistake actually, because when you plant a tree and there is a branch, the branch will not get any higher by the growth of the tree. So that's a sad aspect about it. The tree can be as high, as big as you want. The branch will be always at the same level. But it's this image of expectation, you know. By the growth, you think you will be able to use a swing. I made another version with a rope, you know, to commit suicide. And also that is impossible. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was the very first piece you saw.
Well, that you told me about,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think.
yeah.
And I thought it was very poetic and very touching because obviously, what you
But
say.
what's so typical about Belgium?
You can never use the swing, you know, even though the tree grows.
And
so, I was very intrigued by that.
Well, there was a joke about it because the KBC bank, big Belgian bank, stole my image to make publicity.
Oh.
And I was laughing about it because they gave people hope, but they are not aware of the fact there was no botanical knowledge whatsoever. I mean, people forget it in Belgium. But they gave to the clients the saddest image possible. They could even say, like, put your money on our account, you will never grow. You will never be able to swing. So I was not angry with theft. On contrary, I was laughing at it because they made a completely foolish interpretation. Yeah.
But what does it signify for you, that piece?
Like you say, it's something sad and something hopeful. You know, the nice thing about Pandora's box is that all the bad things came out, and when it was smashed, when the lid was smashed down again, in order not to make escape something, or something more, then something very interesting happened. But very few people know what's inside Pandora's box. But it's in literature, it's antique literature. You know what is in the Pandora's box?
It's a secret.
No, it's not a secret.
But what is in there?
It's described in antique literature. All the bad things came out. She smashed down the lid again, Pandora. And there was one thing that couldn't escape, and it was hope. So if you ask yourself what is the content now of Pandora's box, it's hope. Didn't you know? Yeah, that's fantastic.
Well, there's another piece in a way that is like almost the opposite, which is where Kris makes a line on the wall for every day that he's alive. And how long have you been doing this? When would you start with that piece?
Actually, I didn't do it. It was a piece that was bought by a German collector, a very nice lady who runs an edition company, and I did it on her chimney. So I made a piece called My Days Are Counted, and I put a stripe for every day I lived. And I handed over the pencil to her, and she's adding every day a stripe until I die, and then it's done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had an exhibition one time in San Francisco where I invited Kriss, and in order to make the piece, you first have to do the 30, I don't know, how old are you now?
44.
So maybe that was like when you were 38 or
Yeah.
39.
Yeah.
So I stand there for every day of Kriss's life. I had to make a line. It was like 3 days just making lines, and I kind of was losing my mind to do that. And then once it was done, I was just like, okay, now I only have to do one. And it was sort of like, instead of like measuring the duration of Kriss's life, it was sort of like measuring the duration of each day the show was up, for like the 3 months that the exhibition took place. And I feel like this is sort of like maybe an opposite piece to the one with the swing, that's sort of about not revealing any process, you know, or development.
Well, yeah, but it's another example of something sad and something funny or hopeful. That is, it's like a reversed prison wall, you know? Every day that a prisoner is in the wall, like in the comics, he puts a stripe on the wall, and you're trapped in your life, you know? And every day there's a stripe coming by, and the hope is that it will go on, but you are aware of the fact that it will end, absolutely sure it will end one day. So it's again two-sided, if you want, yeah.
What are artists that you feel a particular affinity with in terms of like how you work aesthetically, but also in relationship to content?
That's a question that people ask me often, and I thought that it was not so relevant, but more and more I think it's very relevant, this question. It's not only affinity, it's also incorporating other people's thoughts. And when they are universal, you can incorporate them, you know? It's not something particular, but for me, the best artist ever, sorry, it's very dangerous what I will say now, but the one who's stopping everything after the Second World War is Felix GonzalezTorres. For me, no doubt. Because in terms of media, he's absolutely free. The medium is also always inferior to the intention. And what I learned from him, I am not as good as Torres, because it's impossible. But what I admire much is that he was able to lift his own proper story to a universal level. Like for me, one of the most exquisite artworks ever is the billboards he made in New York when his boyfriend died. You know, then there were overall New York. Overall, there were big, huge billboards with just the image of an empty bed, a black and white picture of an empty bed, and it's super intimate. It's super personal. You make a picture of your bed being empty. But unfortunately, that's the cruelty of the world. If I would tell you now, my father died, my father didn't die, but if I would tell you now my father died, you would feel sorry maybe, you know, or out of being polite, you would say, well, sorry for you, okay, but it doesn't mean you would actually feel something. And it's normal because we don't share our lives, you know. But if you say death, it appeals. And so it's amazing that such a strong happening, losing your boyfriend, you know, that you are yelling out your grief without noise, and that you don't tell your story, you do it in a very cryptic way. And there is a tension between the personal and the universal so high that I think nobody can ever top that. Therefore, it's my biggest hero, yeah.
I've always thought of Felix GonzalezTorres also very, very highly in terms of like how he was able to find a balance between the aesthetic progress in art and at the same time also being politically very outspoken. And lately, I come to think of it more and more as kitsch. I can't help it, that there's a certain kitsch element because of the sentimentality that is embedded in the work. I don't know if you feel similar at all about it.
Yeah, but I don't mind because I'm super sentimental.
So I was just talking about the political dimension of Felix's work, and do you see a political dimension in your work? I mean, in his case, it's not very obvious, but it's explicit somewhere. I mean, you spend a little bit of time with the work, and you understand what he's trying to say, and using like a vocabulary that is kind of already approved, and it's already incorporated into the canon, like the visual vocabulary of minimal art or conceptual art, and through that he sort of like enters the mainstream art world, and then like other subjects emerge that relate to like the AIDS crisis or other sort of issues like that. And I wonder if you feel like that your work does something similar, or is it politically very different?
Well, it's problematic if you try to think about life and what's around you, what happens around you. You always, I think you can't help getting political at some point, but then at least in a cryptic way. Like now I'm working on a series of pieces, just to explain you very shortly. One of the works is my endpoints. In fact, you should say period or full stop, but endpoint is not common in language, in English language, but it's correct. So,
how do you say it in Flemish?
Endpunt, point final, maybe. But out of my favorite books, I cut out with a scalpel the full stop, so the very last point. And I mounted this little point, this very tiny piece of paper, on an empty sheet of paper. So I made a series of them, and then I mention the title, so endpoint off, then the title of the book, and the author. Now, I'm not a specialist in literature, but I have my favorite books, and everybody has books that changed him or her at some point. It's not always a quality, it can be also a souvenir, somebody who gave it to you. A book can be important in many ways. Anyway, there is a consensus about the fact that the importance of literature is how it changes your mind after the full stop. So everything starts actually with the full stop, with the end. And that's what interests me most, of course. Everything starts with the end. Always the notion of the end and the beginning, that's something, a very important motive throughout my work. And they all have one thing in common, and it's a full stop. And
do you use the first edition of the book?
Sorry?
Do you use the first edition?
Not especially, no, it's not my aim, no. But now I have brought up this idea again. I saw no reason why I would make this series bigger, but I thought about this endpoint project, and now I'm making, and I will present it next month in Paris. I made a series of endpoints of all books about religion. So the endpoint of the Quran, the endpoint of the Bible, the endpoint of the Torah, even Pabai's Tao, all the religions you can imagine, I collected all the books, the most important books, and they will be presented all together, endpoint off. Yeah, so I think it's maybe a good time to do that. Is it a political work? I don't know. I tried to stop talking at the right moment.
I think it's extremely political, because you sort of like, a lot of the work I realize is also about absence, and that absence has a political gesture. When I think, for example, about the piece that we have here, and you have this little bell, but the hammer is missing, which means you can't really mark time. It's empty, and it's sort of like subverting the issue or the subject of time. There's an emptiness, and obviously time is a man-made concept. And what if we didn't come up with the idea of time. And I think the idea of time is very much related to our daily rituals. We get up, we have breakfast, we go to work, and then we go home, and like time shapes our daily work a lot. And I think sort of when you think about sort of Marxist theory, time was always about people going to work and having their own sort of particular schedules, and particularly during the Industrial Revolution, it was much harder and all of that. So I feel that there's a strong political undertone in many of the works because of a certain absence.
Maybe showing or revealing the absence or the void is a political statement on sich.
Yeah. We live in a very short time. If we are lucky, we're going to be 80 years old. But in the spectrum of things, 80 years is very, very little. But we cannot abstract from that. We always think like the moment that we live on is the moment to live in. And I think that with your works, you sort of kind of subvert that concept. We were talking about the little lines. And imagine like you just have a day of your life that might be really meaningful, the day of your life where your children were born. But in the end, it's also just one line, a sad little line with a pencil. Just like the next one where maybe something tragic happened, or
nothing.
Hammarby football team won the Super Cup, So but in the end, they're all the same, That's what I find particularly interesting, and I think it's sort of a very subtle political gesture. I'm just mentioning this whole political aspect, and we've never really talked about this, because of the political situation around the world and like the rise of nationalism and the idea of like deglobalization, where states like become much more isolated, and we have this really big problem in the United States, where I live right now, with Donald Trump, that really pushes into that direction. You have Brexit, and you have the votes coming up, the elections coming up in Europe, where there's a lot of like right-wing parties on the rise, and because of that, I think it's even more important for us as people who work in culture, work in art, work in education to address these topics. Ultimately, I think it's your fault, and it's my fault, and it's the fault of everybody who is in this field that is even happening. We have not been able to educate these people that vote for these parties to develop a larger consciousness about what it means to be a human being and share things with other people. And so it's sort of like, how do we take art out of a bubble?
Well, it's very dangerous. It's very attractive, for instance, to make a piece about Donald Trump. And I think a million pieces will appear soon. Maybe they are existing already. And lately an American asked me, why wouldn't you make a piece about Donald Trump? It's a big inspiration. And my answer was, he's not important enough. I said, whoa, how dare you say that? I mean, Trump is super important. I mean, look what happens now, like you say in America. I say, yes, but still it's too particular, If you look at an art piece in 200-300 years, you need to be half a historian to know who this bloody Trump is, I think it's more interesting and a bigger challenge to try to make in your time, with your small brain, a piece about humanity. And you cannot step out of your time, so you're a witness anyway. And that's what I relieve this seduction file from me for that reason. Because Trump is, per definition, at a certain point, completely unimportant.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's very illustrative to make works that are so directly connected to that. And I remember also because Kris was mentioning Felix GonzalezTorres, and one of the things that I really appreciated also about that artist was that he didn't want to make artwork that was about something he could read in the newspaper. So if you would read about Donald Trump in the newspaper, it's already there. We know the information. This is what it is about. I have to go and add another dimension, the dimension of aesthetics and form to that, and expand that.
If you look at the grave, the tomb of Gertrude Stein, it's just a little piece of flower garden. And there are millions of flower gardens in the world, and by coincidence, that's the tomb of Gertrude Stein. But if you don't know it, you would never know, if you would never discover. So it's not a piece about Gertrude Stein. It's more a Dada, I guess.
one time I wrote a text about Kris's work where I called him the last Christian artist. And one thing that I realize right now, because I'm Jewish, is that the Christians have this idea of the afterlife, no? And it doesn't exist in Judaism. But in fact, your work is actually about the absence of an afterlife, no? And
It's doubt. It's all about doubt, of course. So one of the best examples is, but it's a pity you don't see any work, and it's even more a pity that Belgians don't know my work. But you know that in history the church has sold millions of, how do you call it, documents that guarantee afterlife. You know, they earned a fortune by selling that all the time. And I did it again. So I made a poster saying life after death for ... and then time and place. So I think by now I have sold something like 200 of them. A collector wants, nice piece, okay, life after death, and then I inscribe the name of the collector, the time and the place. And you know what? It's so nice. What's so nice about it is people are superstitious. And then a week or 2 weeks later, they call, oh, yeah, actually I came home and my wife was not very happy, so I need one for my wife, for my children, my grandchildren. It's really interesting. Even for the dog and the cat, I did it already. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so if you don't believe in it, there you have it, you know. I give it to you.
One thing that came to my mind when we were talking about sort of like the insignificance of time, or the sort of our inability to really like think about time on the long term, is a quote by Deng Xiaoping, who was the chairman of the Communist Party in China after Mao Zedong. And Deng Xiaoping was asked what he thought about the French Revolution. And he said, it's too early to tell. So you sort of like see like people have completely different notions and ideas of time. Like something that happened in like the beginning of the 19th century, and he was asked 150 years later what he thought about it. So that quote always resonated with me very strongly. You know?
I can imagine, but I feel closer to, for instance, Valerie Giscard. Yeah, you know why? Because not so long ago, one of my best friends was at a dinner, because he's very good friends with Giscard d'Estaing, and it was about China. And it was, of course, the éminence grise of the table. He was sitting, there was a president of the table, a very chic dîner in Paris. And my friend almost couldn't tell about it because he was crying of laughing. And so Giscard d'Estaing, with his ring, gets attention by hitting a glass, ting ting, oh, he will speech. It's not a joke, it's a historical fact. And he raises up, he stands up, and he starts talking. Tang tai si, shung hui ha de shom toi, wu jing kai te boy. He goes on for a couple of minutes, sits down, everybody jumps up, bravo, bravo, génial, fantastic. And my friend asked, but Giscard, but Valerie, what did you say? I don't know, I don't speak a word of Chinese. I think that's art. That's art.
It's very subversive.
And it's
Dada.
also very political, if
very
you want.
Dada.
Yeah, it's very Dada, but he did it.
And nobody actually picked up on it?
No, nobody, because he was so clever to discover that there was no Chinese at the table. Yeah. And so that's what I really like, you know, because people think he's saying something fantastic, genius, but he was just making a joke.
When I was in theater school, and this is like a really silly anecdote, but it relates to that. I went to a theater school. I wanted to be a theater director. And after the wall came down, I wanted to go to the school that Bert Brecht started. You know, it was a dream. Oh, I'm going to like study with the teachers of Bert Brecht. And the interesting thing was with these teachers, they were all East Germans, and they could not speak any other foreign language but Russian. And so they came up with this idea which is called grammar law. And grammar law is a term that describes exactly what he did. You fake a language. You make it sound as, maybe you know 2-3 words that you throw in there, but it sounds like if it's English or French or Chinese. And I thought that was very funny in relationship to what you say. But this also brings us back to the exhibition and how very, very insignificant, or for you or for me, very insignificant little objects can have so much meaning for one person, and how important they are to them. And I thought that was like such a beautiful and interesting thing to explore.
I think so too, because, you know, one of the biggest mistakes you can make as an artist is to underestimate the audience. And sometimes I'm very punished by that. Like, sometimes I make a piece in a too short time, and then I'm punished for that because it has no attention or success at all. And lately I had a show at Johann König in Berlin, and there was one silly photograph that I had worked on for a year. So a friend of mine got cancer. And I said, oh my God, yeah, okay, I will burn a candle for you. The Catholic guy is coming up again, you know. But I do it, I'm the 3rd generation candle burner. My grandmother did it, then my mother, now it's me. And we are very good at it, because not a single candle left us at stake so far. I hope it continues that way. And he said, I said, well, how long will your treatment go on? And he said, well, for a year. And I said, well, I will burn a candle every day for you. He said, yeah, right, I don't believe you. And every day, whether I was at home or in New York or wherever, I lit a candle, and I took a picture with my iPhone, and I sent it to him, a year long. And then I asked to Photolab to make, like all those pictures transparent, so to speak. Of course, they are digital files, but make all those pictures transparent and layer them, one upon another one. And so you have the mixture of 365 images of a burning candle. And the result was like a little Turner piece with a light in the middle where I focused on the flame. Quite abstract, actually. Only at the side you saw some details of furniture or whatever. And people really went like flies to that image. And I learned something. It was like, it's not revealing anything. Definitely not the story of my friend who's got cancer, because this story was definitely not revealed when the show was opening, reminding Torres and the bad.
Yeah.
But I was flabbergasted to see how people were so much attracted to this piece because maybe of this unintended intensity. And I learned a very important lesson, and it's this intensity. Like, you see objects, but it's very intense because it radiates something. When it's important to somebody, it radiates it's important to somebody. It's just not an object. And I was very curious to see this show for the single reason that I think 15 years ago, in the Smack Museum in Ghent, Jan Hoet Sr. was organizing an exhibition where he invited, it's 20 years ago, and the show was called Rendezvous. And it was a very interesting show because he asked the inhabitants of Ghent to bring to the museum an object, like you invited artists to do the same, to bring a personal object to the museum. But the big difference was that his intention was to make artists that they did an intervention, that they made an intervention on that object, that they lifted it to an art piece by destroying it, by adding something, by
altering it in some way.
Yeah. But I still doubt whether this was an interesting exhibition, you know?
Yeah.
Maybe leaving it alone for what it is and as it is in its nature is more interesting, because this is, for me personally, I'm not criticizing Jan Hoet, or maybe why not, you know? We were good friends, so I can, even after his death, I can criticize him, because I'm respecting him still so much. But maybe the strength of this show is that there is no intervention at all, and that the enigma is still there, you know?
One of the things that I was thinking when I was putting the show together, and I don't know, has anybody read any of the stories in the book? So each artist is describing what their objects means to them, and I wanted to find Kris's entry here and read that to you. This is the other Kris Martin. So this says, this is Chris's piece here. As a child, I went on holiday to Spain with my parents. I saw this little bell located in a shop and really liked it. My parents bought it for me as a present, and it remains a very dear souvenir. At one point, the bell lost its clapper. This later became the inspiration for a 2012 work titled "For Whom?", a large bell without a clapper that now resides at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. So when I was going through these books and reading the stories, I was thinking, like, what is the relationship between the stories and the oral history of these objects and the objects themselves? And what is the exhibition actually about? Is it about the objects, or is it about these stories that really tell you where these things are coming from and what the meaning really is? Because if you look at them, they're curiosities, they're funny, they're cute, they're like interesting, they have nice shapes, they might even reveal something beyond what the artist had intended and why they selected them. But I was wondering, like yesterday, like where's the balance and what is the show really about? Is it about the stories or is it about the objects? Or maybe is it about both?
I think it's more about the void, the lack of information. Because, as I said, people are free, people are not stupid. People can add something to an object with their own imagination. I can give even an example of my own work. In the fields, my parents are living in the countryside, and in the fields in winter you can find thousands of artifacts because these lands have been cultivated for centuries, and so you even find little particles of China, and I found a particle, like a little part of China with a head, a Chinese head. Then I found a part with a horse foot, and I mounted them on sheets of paper. So you have a sheet of paper with a tiny piece of China, and people immediately complete the whole image with their imagination. You see a horse foot, and immediately it triggers your imagination. Same with this. I mean, I think that the pars pro toto is more interesting than the toto, than the totum. And talking about the void, just a couple of minutes ago, I made this big flipboard that you can see in railway stations and airports, and it's functioning perfectly, but randomly, but no single flap has been printed with either letters or digits, and it remains entirely black. And in the Berlin Biennial, way back, I saw people standing in front of the flipboard like half an hour. Not that they were stupid and waiting for information, but maybe just in enjoying the void, because in the void, in the absence of information, there is freedom. And your imagination can work there.
Yeah.
And now we are living in an information world. Everything is information, too much information, even artist information. Every art piece is information, and I try to avoid information, to give information, because it's the only way of activating someone's brain.
I'm like extremely interested in anthropology, and feel like that part of my curatorial work has a lot to do with anthropology, sort of like studying objects and trying to see what are these objects signify within particular cultures. And I think this is sort of like has a little bit to do with that, perhaps. And of course, one part of thinking about anthropology is about going back to very, very basic questions. Where do we come from? Where do we go? What is our purpose in life? And how do we manifest what we do during our lifetime here? And that piece with the flipboard, when I saw it for the first time, and I almost started to cry, because it's like, wow, okay, we don't come from anywhere. There's no destination. There's no departure. There's nowhere. It's just like this blank thing that is black, and that was a work that really resonated with me very, very strongly. Anyway, Kris and I have chatted a lot, and I hope you enjoyed it.
5% of the audience went off.
Yeah, but other people came in, and it went over their head, unfortunately. I don't know, maybe they went to get a coffee, it's early. So I wondered if there's any questions from the audience for either Kris or me. Would be very happy to answer those. And I don't know if Paul, do we have another microphone, or should we just use this one?
We can share this one.
Yeah.
Hi, I have two very simple questions. Ask you, why did you decide on the colors of the?
Well, one thing I had in mind was very much like looking at historical cabinets of curiosities and sort of mimicking that to a certain degree, but not replicating that. And so the first vitrines that we designed with the architects were actually the wooden ones. And we did a prototype, and I really, really liked them. But then we felt like in order to have a little bit of diversity, let's try to figure out a few other ones. So we built these tables. And the accents, the yellow accents and the red accents, was really purely something that the designer wanted to do because of a sort of design consistency with the space that is behind that, which is like a cafe, restaurant sort of situation. So we felt like, even though those are completely different parts, that there is a certain aesthetic consistency within the entire space here. So there is no particular like meaning or deeper meaning to that. And you know, if you ask me, I could have like totally lived without the yellow. It could have been green, and everything could have been green. I'm more of a minimalist, but that's why I also insisted on like having these wooden vitrines. But if you look at the vitrines, each of them is different. There's not one that is similar to the other. Yeah. Like the tables have 3 lamps on top, this table has 2 lamps on top. And if you, so that was something that I really wanted to do, like that there is a similarity between each of these vitrines, but also a little bit of an alteration. And when I arrived here on Monday, we had all the objects laid out. I really started to sort of like think what works with which other objects, how do we install it, and that was like the most wonderful moment for me to sort of like really see, to realize, oh yeah, let's put the kimono up there hanging like this, and so, you know, go from object to object and try to even tell little stories, you know, like you see like here, Mathieu Mercier's little pencil, and then next to it is a pencil sharpener, and next to it is a little booklet where you learn how to write, and then ultimately the book comes up. So there's like little stories. In some cases it works really well, in others maybe not so much. I mean, you have the Hillary Clinton and the Ronald Reagan there and things like that, that sort of like are also little jokes or, you know, humorous interventions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And the other question is for Kris. I mean, this is probably something you've been asked a lot, but have you ever met the other Kris Martin?
No.
Okay. And would you ever be...
Which one, the singer or the painter?
The painter.
Ah, no.
And would you ever be open to collaboration with him one day?
Well, why not? I mean, I don't know. It depends. Okay. You know, it's a lot of coincidence going on. So for my next exhibition, I have some names in my mind. But at the last day, somebody could pass by and say, hi. I leave it open, you know. It's not a very closed concept, to be honest. But the nice thing is that by this openness and trying to be generous and collegial, you know, I'm not a saint. I know I'm not a saint. But trying to do so and to have those 2 proofs, those 2 former exhibitions, Saint-Jan in Ghent and then the small villages, I can give you just one example. I was thinking about the 3rd exhibition, and one of the first artists I was talking to was Thierry Decordier, because I'm a very big admirer of Thierry Decordier. And I said, well, I have to ask you something. And he said, well, Kris, the answer is yes. Now ask your question. You see? So it proves that you have built up credibility amongst colleagues, and that's very important, because they know I don't do it for my own, you know, ego, whatever. They know my intentions after 2 times, and it's so nice. Even Luc Tuymans said, kom hier schat, we'll start, you know, and everybody's participating like this, and it has nothing to do with power. It has nothing to do. I have more the feeling that artists are happy to join something that is completely apart from the market and the institutional world. Yeah, like I made an exhibition lately in Rome. Well, Tim and I did. That's my studio manager. And I was so happy to make an exhibition in Santa Sabina. It's a church on the Aventino in Rome, and it's actually the headquarters of the Dominican community, and they were celebrating their 800 years of existence. And they wanted to celebrate it with an exhibition of my works. And I was very happy because, you know, far from the market, far from the institutional world, I could swim like a fish in the water. I had carte blanche, I could do whatever in a church that dates from the 5th century, you know. And that's what we actually should go back to do things because we want to do things. And I know even famous artists, I will not tell names, but it's not uncommon that a gallerist says, oh, there is a fair coming up. Could you make me, please, 4 canvases of 30 by 40 and 2 of 50 by 70, and if you find time, maybe 1 of 1.5 meters by 2. Now, the sad story is, they do it.
So the bell still actually has a clapper.
They do it, yes, but I forgot to switch it off. Sorry, it's my gallerist. You see? Yeah.
Why didn't he come here?
I don't know. She knew it was going on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway,
Have a word with her.
she has lots of things to do. I don't know whether this is an answer, but I'm far from the subject maybe already.
No, but that's good. That's perfect. Thank you.
Sorry.
This is a question to the curator. To what extent do you think the artist took this assignment serious? Like I see a guy taking some booze or something, and then an empty space. I think it's air. So yeah, that's my question to you.
Which booze? This?
Yeah.
Well, this is very interesting because the booze and the cologne are his name, Boris Ashur. So he found these objects and he has given them, they were given to him by his brother. So he has kept them for a very long time. And what I sort of noticed is in many cases is that even though they're giving us these objects, they are also kind of sometimes continuing a little bit of what they do as an artist. So in one way or another, this is also an artwork by Boris, or this is also an artwork in one way or the other by Kriss. I have to say, and this really resonates or connects to what Kriss said, that there was such an enthusiastic response by the artists when we proposed this, because I was worried. It's like, the artists have no time, they're not going to be interested, or they're going to send us things that are like completely meaningless. And I was so surprised. Like the Larry Clark paintbrush, for example, you know, like in the story that he writes, well, I've always been a photographer, and now I'm like 75 years old, and I wanted to start painting. And here's the paintbrush that I use in my studio when I started painting like 5 years ago. So people really took it serious, and they wrote like these like incredible stories, and was very, very surprised and very positively surprised, I have to say.
Yeah, because I also think it's really nice because artists, their profession is making art, but for an artist, maybe an object, a daily life object, can become art for them without being art for another person, just because it's his own impression of the object and his own emotional attachment.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't consider any of this art.
Yeah.
You know, this is not art for me in that way. But you know, it's sort of like on a border. It's like the question, like a Robert Barry, where you say there's nothing there. Well, when you read his statement, it says, my work is the space between two objects. So it's between that rubber mask by Vibeke Tandberg and Joseph Kossuth's autograph of Hillary Clinton. And that's like his work, you know, because he does these immaterial artwork. So it's sort of like a piece that is pretty much close to his own work, but at the same time relates to the show, because he's talking about these two objects.
I think it's quite special, the exhibition. It's really nice.
Thank you, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, if there aren't any more questions, then I thank you very much for coming and for your interest on this Friday morning. And thanks to Kris Martin.